And the political fallout? Did the Allies start to waver?
Immediately. This was perhaps the most dangerous consequence for Rome. Several key Roman allies in southern Italy, seeing Rome so utterly defeated, lost faith or saw opportunity. The most important defection was Capua, the second largest city in Italy at the time. Others followed. It looked like Hannibal's strategy of dismantling Rome's alliance system was finally working. Rome's power network was genuinely shaking.
Any other strategic effects? Wider ripples?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Across the Adriatic, King Philip V of Macedon saw Rome weakened and decided this was his chance. He allied with Hannibal, starting the First Macedonian War and forcing Rome to devote precious resources and attention to Greece. Hannibal also gained ground in Sicily, supporting an anti-Roman faction that took control of the powerful city of Syracuse after the death of Rome's old ally there. Cannae sent shockwaves across the whole Mediterranean world.
Okay, so after this absolutely crushing victory, arguably one of the most complete tactical victories in all of military history, the big question arises, the one that's been debated for over 2,000 years. Why didn't Hannibal march directly on Rome immediately after Cannae?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The sources offer a few potential reasons. One practical argument often cited, even by Livy, is that Hannibal lacked the necessary heavy siege equipment catapults, siege towers required to breach Rome's formidable defensive walls. And taking a city like Rome by storm would have been incredibly costly, even if possible.
Makes sense. Sieges were long, difficult affairs.
Very. Another perspective, maybe more strategic, is that Hannibal's ultimate goal wasn't necessarily about capturing the city of Rome itself, at least not in the short term. He understood Rome's deep-seated resilience, its ability to raise new armies. He might have believed that even if he besieged Rome, the remaining Roman allies would rally, Roman forces elsewhere could converge, and he'd be caught. His primary aim, arguably, was still to dismantle Rome's confederation, to isolate the city politically and militarily by breaking its network of alliances in Italy. He hoped Capua's defection was just the start.
So win the war by making Rome irrelevant in Italy, rather than by taking the city itself.
That seems a plausible reading of his strategy. Make Rome just one city-state among others again, not the master of Italy. There's that famous, possibly apocryphal story where his cavalry commander, Hannibal, supposedly urges him right after Cannae, "Send me on with the cavalry you follow, and in 5 days you will dine on the capital." When Hannibal hesitated, Hannibal allegedly shot back, "Truly, the gods have not given everything to one man. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one."
Oof. Harsh words, if true.
Yeah. Whether it happened or not, it captures the debate perfectly. So instead of marching on Rome, Hannibal chose to move south, consolidate his gains, secure the allegiance of defecting cities like Capua, and hope that Rome would eventually crumble politically as its allies abandoned it.
But Rome, battered, bleeding, terrified, didn't collapse.
It didn't, and this is where you see the other side of the story, Rome's incredible, almost unbelievable resilience. Despite the devastation of Cannae, the sheer shock and loss, they just refused to give up.
What did they do? How did they respond?
Well, crucially, they went back to the strategy that had shown some promise before, the Fabian strategy. Fabius Maximus himself was re-elected consul multiple times in the following years. Rome basically decided, okay, we can't beat this guy in a pitched battle right now.
So back to avoiding Hannibal's main army.
Exactly. They avoided large-scale confrontations with Hannibal's main force in southern Italy. Instead, they focused on containment, using Fabian tactics, shadowing him, harassing his supplies, but primarily concentrating their efforts on slowly, painstakingly, retaking the towns and fortresses that had defected to him.
Yeah.
It was a long, grinding war of sieges and small-scale engagements.
Leaning back the allies piece by piece.
Precisely. A significant victory in this long game was the recapture of the important port city of Tarentum in 209 BC. Hannibal had held it for 3 years, but the Romans took it back through stealth and betrayal. This patient, persistent approach was absolutely key to preventing further widespread defections and slowly turning the tide in Italy.
So Hannibal's situation in Italy, even though he was undefeated in major battles, became increasingly difficult.
Yes, it became a strategic stalemate for him in the south. He was winning battles, but losing the war in a sense. He couldn't force Rome into another Cannae, and he didn't have the resources to conduct effective sieges against loyal Roman allies, or Rome itself. He was essentially contained in southern Italy. Then came a really crucial moment in 207 BC.
What happened then?
His brother, also named Hasdrubal, who had been fighting the Romans fiercely in Spain, finally managed to evade the Roman forces there. He gathered a large army, including reinforcements meant for Hannibal, and successfully crossed the Alps, arriving in northern Italy.
Reinforcements, just what Hannibal needed.
Desperately needed. Hasdrubal sent messengers south to coordinate with Hannibal, planning to link up their armies. But the Romans intercepted those messengers. They knew Hasdrubal's location and his plans.
Oh no.
Yeah. In a swift and decisive move, the Roman consuls commanding in the north and south combined their forces, marched rapidly north, and confronted Hasdrubal's army near the Metaurus River in northern Italy, before Hannibal even knew his brother was close.
The Battle of the Metaurus.
An absolutely crucial battle. The Romans won decisively. Hasdrubal himself was killed in the fighting. And in a particularly gruesome gesture, the Romans apparently threw Hasdrubal's severed head into Hannibal's camp a few days later.
That's brutal. What a message.
A devastating message. For Hannibal, this was a crushing blow. It meant no significant reinforcements were coming from Spain. It basically doomed his strategy of wearing Rome down in Italy. He knew then, most likely, that he couldn't win the war in Italy anymore.
So while Hannibal is struggling, contained in Italy, Rome starts thinking about taking the fight elsewhere.
Exactly. While the Fabian strategy was slowly working in Italy, Rome was also developing a new generation of commanders and a new, bolder strategy. And the leading proponent of this was a young, dynamic general who had learned harsh lessons fighting Hannibal's forces in Spain, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus.
Scipio, the man who would eventually defeat Hannibal. What was his idea?
Scipio argued for a radical shift. He said, stop just defending Italy, let's take the fight directly to Carthage, let's invade North Africa.
Invade Carthage itself. That sounds risky.
It was incredibly controversial at the time. Older, more cautious senators like Fabius Maximus strongly opposed it. They argued it was far too risky, that it would leave Rome vulnerable, that they should focus on driving Hannibal out of Italy first. But Scipio, who had achieved remarkable success commanding Roman forces in Spain, basically reconquering most of what Carthage had held there, had immense popular support and eventually convinced the Senate to let him try.
Though they didn't give him a huge army initially, did they?
No, the Senate was still hesitant. They gave him command in Sicily, but initially only allowed him to use volunteers and the 2 legions that had survived Cannae, which were stationed there almost in disgrace. But Scipio trained them rigorously, gathered more resources and ships, and finally in 204 BC, he successfully landed a well-prepared army in North Africa near Utica.
So the war comes home to Carthage. How did Scipio fare?
Once in Africa, Scipio quickly demonstrated his own brand of strategic genius. He wasn't just a copy of Hannibal. He was adaptable, innovative, and brilliant in his own right. He won early victories, often using clever, feigned retreats and maneuvers to lure out and destroy Carthaginian cavalry forces. He laid siege to the important port city of Utica.
Did Carthage just roll over?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Carthage raised new armies. They also had a powerful ally in Syphax, king of the most powerful Numidian tribes nearby. For a time, Scipio found himself facing a very large combined Carthaginian and Numidian force, significantly outnumbering his own army. He had to make a tactical withdrawal, fortifying a position on a peninsula with his back to the sea. Some critics back in Rome probably saw this as weakness.
But it wasn't.
It wasn't fear, it was calculation. From that secure base, Scipio planned and executed a devastating surprise night raid on the 2 separate enemy camps, the Carthaginian one and Syphax's Numidian one nearby. His soldiers set fire to their flimsy reed and wood shelters. Panic erupted. In the chaos and darkness, thousands were killed or captured. It was a stunning victory that shattered a large portion of Carthage's field forces and Syphax's power.
Wow. Turning the tables with unconventional tactics.
Yeah, exactly. Scipio then pressed his advantage. He won another major battle, decisively defeating the Carthaginians and the remnants of Syphax's forces. He started marching towards Tunis, putting direct pressure on the city of Carthage itself. This relentless campaign finally had the desired effect. It broke Carthage's will to resist. They opened negotiations and sued for peace.
Peace talks begin. What were the proposed terms?
The initial terms Scipio offered were harsh, but not fatal. Carthage would lose all its overseas territories, especially Spain. Its navy would be drastically reduced to just a handful of ships. They'd have to pay a huge war indemnity over many years. But crucially, Carthage itself would survive as an independent state in its African territory.
That sounds almost generous, considering. Did peace happen?
It seemed imminent. The terms were sent back to Rome for ratification. But then 2 things happened. First, a Roman supply fleet carrying food and equipment for Scipio's army was driven ashore by a storm near Tunis, and the desperate Carthaginians seized the supplies. This angered the Romans. And second, perhaps more importantly, the faction in Carthage that wanted to keep fighting gained the upper hand. They decided to recall their greatest asset. They recalled Hannibal and his veteran army from Italy. With their legendary general back home, bringing the hardened survivors of his 15-year campaign in Italy, the Carthaginians felt emboldened. They abruptly broke off the peace negotiations, reneged on the truce, and prepared for one last desperate roll of the dice. The stage was set for the final, decisive confrontation.
And that showdown happened at Zama.
Zama? Probably fought somewhere southwest of Carthage, near a town called Naragra, maybe modern Sakiet Sidi Yusuf in Tunisia. The date, October 19th, 202 BC. On one side, Scipio Africanus commanding the Roman legions and their crucial Numidian allies. On the other, Hannibal Barca leading the Carthaginians and his Italian veterans. The fate of the Western Mediterranean hung in the balance.
Okay, let's break down the armies at Zama. How do they stack up?
It's interesting. Hannibal actually had a larger total force this time, numerically, maybe around 50,000 men in total, including a significant number of war elephants, perhaps 80 or so, though they were apparently not well trained. Scipio had fewer troops overall, maybe 43,000. But Scipio had one absolutely critical advantage: cavalry. Thanks to his diplomacy and victories, Scipio had secured a vital alliance with Massinissa, the new king of the Numidians, Syphax's rival, who Scipio had helped put on the throne. Massinissa brought with him superb Numidian-like cavalry. Combined with Scipio's own Roman cavalry, this gave Scipio a clear superiority in cavalry numbers and quality. Hannibal, after years of attrition in Italy and having lost many of his original riders, had a much weaker, less experienced cavalry arm at Zama.
That sounds like a reversal of the situation at Cannae. How did Hannibal deploy his forces, knowing this?
He deployed his army in unprecedented depth, 3 distinct lines of infantry. Way out in front, he placed his war elephants, hoping they would disrupt and disorder the Roman legion's advance. His first line of infantry was composed of his least reliable troops: Gallic, Ligurian, and Balearic mercenaries, essentially cannon fodder to absorb the initial Roman impact.
Okay, elephants then mercenaries. What next?
His second line consisted of his Carthaginian and Libyan citizen levies, probably tougher than the mercenaries, but not his elite. And then, held significantly further back, maybe 200 yards or more, was his third line: the hardened veterans of his Italian campaign, his best soldiers, his trump card.
So the plan was: elephants break up the Romans, mercenaries absorb the charge, citizen troops wear them down further, and then the fresh veterans deliver the killing blow.
That seems to be the logic. Use depth and the elephants to counter the Roman legion's initial charge and discipline, hoping the battle would degenerate into a slugfest where his experienced veterans could prevail against tired Romans. His weak cavalry was placed on the wings, likely just hoping to hold Scipio's cavalry for as long as possible.
A plan born of necessity, perhaps. But Scipio, knowing Hannibal, knowing about the elephants, he must have had a counterplan.
He absolutely did. Scipio had studied Hannibal, respected him immensely, but also understood his likely tactics, and he came up with an ingenious counter specifically for the elephants.
What was it?
Instead of forming his legions in the usual solid checkerboard pattern, the triplex XDs, Scipio arranged his maniples the basic tactical subunits, like companies and columns, one behind the other. This created wide, clear lanes running straight through his entire formation, from front to back.
Lanes through the army? Why?
To channel the elephants. The plan was, when the elephants charged, the Roman skirmishers, the velites, in front would provoke them with javelins and noise, and then retreat through these lanes. The elephants, tending to charge straight ahead, would hopefully just run harmlessly down these corridors and out the back of the Roman formation, without ever smashing into the main blocks of heavy infantry.
That's brilliant. Using the elephant's own momentum against them.
It was incredibly clever tactical thinking. Okay, so the battle begins. What happens first?
Usually cavalry, right?
Right. The cavalry engagement kicked off the battle. And just as Scipio hoped, his superior Roman and, crucially, Massinissa's Numidian cavalry quickly overwhelmed Hannibal's weaker Carthaginian and Numidian horsemen on both wings. They drove them from the field.
Did they pursue them endlessly like sometimes happened?
This is where Scipio's discipline, or perhaps Massinissa's understanding of the plan, was key. They pursued them for a short distance, ensuring they were broken, but then critically, they didn't just vanish chasing loot or glory. They started the process of regrouping, ready to return to the main battlefield when the decisive moment came. This was huge.
Okay, cavalry wings clear, then comes the elephant charge.
Yes. Hannibal unleashed his 80 elephants. But Scipio's plan worked almost perfectly. Many of the elephants, panicked by the noise, the trumpets, the javelins from the Roman skirmishers, charged straight down the lane Scipio had created and out the back. Others veered off to the sides, and some, disastrously for Hannibal, panicked completely and turned back, crashing into Hannibal's own first line of mercenaries, causing chaos and disorder there even before the Romans reached them. The elephant charge was largely neutralized.
Amazing. So now it's infantry on infantry.
Roman legions advance. They hit Hannibal's first line, the mercenaries, who were already shaken by the rampaging elephants. They fought for a bit, but eventually broke under the disciplined pressure of the Roman heavy infantry. They tried to fall back, but Hannibal's second line, the Carthaginian citizens, apparently had orders not to let the fleeing mercenaries through their ranks, forcing them to flee sideways or be cut down.
Harsh, but maintains the second line's order.
Right. So the Roman legions, having pushed through the first line, now engaged Hannibal's second line, the Carthaginian and Libyan troops. This was a much tougher fight. These guys fought hard for their homes, but eventually they too began to give way under the relentless, methodical advance of the Roman maniples.
Which brings the Romans finally face to face with
Hannibal's third line, his veterans from Italy. Held back, fresh, composed of the best soldiers Hannibal had. Scipio had to pause, reorganize his own lines, which had become somewhat disordered after pushing through the first two Carthaginian lines. He brought his second and third line troops, the Principes and Triarii, up to form one solid main line to face Hannibal's elite.
the climax of the battle.
Absolutely. The sources describe this final phase as incredibly fierce, brutal, and for a long time evenly matched. Roman discipline versus Hannibalic experience and desperation. It was a bloody stalemate for quite a while. The battle really hung in the balance right here.
But then the cavalry returns.
Then came the turning point. Scipio's Roman cavalry and Massinius's Numidians, having successfully regrouped after driving off Hannibal's horsemen, returned to the battlefield. And they didn't just hit the flanks. They swept around and slammed into the rear of Hannibal's veteran third line, which was locked in that desperate struggle with Scipio's infantry.
Cannae in reverse.
Precisely. Attacked from the front by Scipio's legions, and now unexpectedly crushed from behind by the returning allied cavalry, even Hannibal's veterans couldn't withstand it. Their formation finally broke. The Carthaginian army collapsed into a rout.
A complete victory for Scipio.
A total decisive victory. The casualties at Zama were again immense, particularly for Carthage. Our ancient sources, likely with some Roman bias but probably reflecting the scale, estimate maybe 20,000 Carthaginian soldiers killed and perhaps another 15,000 to 20,000 captured. Roman losses were comparatively light, maybe only 1,500 killed, though likely more wounded. Regardless of the exact figures, Carthage's army was shattered. Hannibal himself barely escaped the battlefield.
And Zama. That was it, wasn't it? The end of the Second Punic War.
Effectively, yes. Carthage had no army left, no way to resist Scipio's demands. They had no choice but to sue for peace immediately. And this time, the terms imposed by Rome, largely dictated by Scipio but confirmed by the Senate, were absolutely crushing. They were designed to ensure Carthage could never ever again pose a military threat to Rome.
What were the final terms?
Devastating. Carthage had to pay an absolutely astronomical war indemnity spread over 50 years, effectively crippling its economy for generations. It had to surrender its entire war fleet except for a token force of just 10 small ships for coastal policing. It lost all its territories outside of its core homeland in North Africa. Spain gone, Mediterranean islands gone. And even within Africa, its territory was reduced, with much land given to Rome's ally, Massinissa.
And the killer clause.
The killer clause. Carthage was forbidden from waging war anywhere, even defensively within Africa against neighbors like Massinissa, without first getting explicit permission from the Roman Senate. They were essentially stripped of their sovereignty in foreign policy and military matters.
Wow. That really sets them up for future trouble, doesn't it? Especially with Massinissa as a neighbor.
Exactly. Massinissa, the Numidian king who had helped Scipio win at Zama, was rewarded handsomely by Rome with Carthaginian territory. And over the next 50 years, he constantly encroached on Carthage's remaining lands, seized ports, provoked incidents. Knowing Carthage couldn't legally fight back without Rome's say-so, and Rome usually turned a blind eye or sided with Massinissa.
Until Carthage finally snapped.
But eventually, around 150 BC, after decades of this harassment, Carthage couldn't take it anymore. They raised an army and fought back against Massinissa without getting Rome's permission. And that gave the hardliners in Rome, people like Cato the Elder, who famously ended every speech with Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, the exact pretext they needed.
The Third Punic War.
Which wasn't really a war, more of a final siege. Rome demanded impossible terms, then besieged the city for 3 years. When Carthage finally fell in 146 BC, the Romans utterly destroyed it. Razed the buildings, sowed the fields with salt according to legend, though that might be an embellishment, sold the survivors into slavery, ensuring Carthage would never ever rise again as a rival.
So, the Punic Wars, starting way back with Sicily, culminating really at Zama with Scipio's victory, weren't just a series of conflicts. They were the crucible that truly forged Rome's dominance, weren't they?
Absolutely. Winning these wars, especially the second one, against such a formidable opponent as Hannibal, cemented Rome's control over the entire Western Mediterranean. It eliminated its only serious rival and provided the resources, manpower, and confidence for Rome's subsequent expansion eastwards into Greece, Asia Minor, and beyond. It laid the groundwork for the vast Roman Empire that would shape Europe and North Africa for centuries to come.
And what happened to Hannibal himself after the defeat at Zama? His story doesn't just end there, right?
No, his personal story continued for almost 2 more decades. He returned to Carthage after Zama and, perhaps surprisingly, entered politics. He was elected as a suffus, one of Carthage's chief magistrates, and apparently he proved to be a very effective civic leader. He pushed through reforms tackling the entrenched corruption of the Carthaginian aristocracy, restructured the state's finances to make it possible to actually pay the crippling Roman indemnity without crushing the populace with taxes.
So a successful peacetime leader, too.
It seems so. But his success and his continued, shall we say, anti-Roman stance made him powerful enemies, both within the Carthaginian oligarchy, whose power he threatened, and more importantly, in Rome. The Romans never stopped fearing or mistrusting him. They eventually put pressure on Carthage to hand him over.
So he had to flee.
Facing arrest and extradition to Rome, Hannibal chose exile, probably around 195 BC. He spent his later years wandering the eastern Mediterranean, essentially becoming a high-profile military advisor to various Hellenistic kings and rulers who were themselves resisting Roman expansionism.
A sort of freelance anti-Roman consultant.
You could put it that way. He advised King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire in his war against Rome, though his advice wasn't always taken. He spent time in Armenia and later in Bithynia, a kingdom in northwestern Anatolia, modern Turkey. There's even a historical note connecting him to the founding or refounding of the city of Prusa, modern Bursa, in Turkey.
And how did his life finally end?
His final act came while he was in Bithynia, near modern Gebze in Turkey. The Romans, relentless as ever, tracked him down and demanded the Bithynian king hand him over. Faced with the imminent threat of betrayal and capture, Hannibal, probably around 183 or 182 BC, took poison, which he reportedly carried with him hidden in a ring for just such an eventuality. He chose to die on his own terms, denying Rome the satisfaction of parading him through their city in chains. There's a modern monument near Gebze commemorating him today.
Wow, what a life. So his legacy as a commander, undeniably one of the greats.
Oh, absolutely. He's universally ranked right up there with Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, as one of the most brilliant military minds in all of history. His tactical masterpiece at Cannae, the double envelopment, is still studied intensely in military academies worldwide as a prime example of battlefield genius.
And it wasn't just Cannae, was it?
No, his entire Italian campaign was marked by brilliant maneuvers, clever ambushes like Trebia and Trasimene, excellent use of intelligence and terrain, and an incredible ability to inspire loyalty in his diverse mercenary army over 15 long, hard years far from home. Military historians like Theodore Errol Dodge went so far as to call him the father of military strategy, arguing that Rome itself, despite ultimately defeating him, learned invaluable lessons from him and incorporated some of his strategic and tactical ideas into their own evolving military doctrine.
Think about that. The enemy literally teaching you how to fight better, forcing you to improve.
Exactly. There's that famous anecdote, probably fictional, but it perfectly illustrates his reputation, where Scipio Africanus supposedly met Hannibal years later in exile and asked him who he thought were the greatest generals in history. Hannibal supposedly named Alexander the Great first, then Pyrrhus of Arauria second, and himself third. Scipio then asked, "And what would you have said if you had defeated me?" Hannibal allegedly replied that I would have placed myself before Alexander, before Pyrrhus, and before all other generals.
Haha. Great story, true or not. It shows the respect, maybe even the fear he commanded. Even the Roman historians, who obviously had a bias against him and often portrayed him as cruel or treacherous, couldn't help but acknowledge his military genius. That phrase, Hannibal ante portas, wasn't just a saying. It reflected a very real, visceral fear in Rome for years.
And interestingly, some of our sources even hint the long reach of his strategic thinking, suggesting elements of his principles might have influenced military planning centuries later, maybe even echoes in campaigns like the Turkish War of Independence. His impact was profound.
This whole incredible story, this clash of titans, naturally leads us to that big what if question, doesn't it? We've seen discussions online, like on Reddit threads people shared with us, debating the historical importance of the Punic Wars. What if Hannibal had won at Zama? What if Carthage had somehow prevailed in the end?
It's one of history's great counterfactuals, isn't it? It's fascinating to think about. You can imagine a world where maybe a Semitic language related to Phoenician and Hebrew became the dominant lingua franca of the Western Mediterranean instead of Latin. Perhaps a different legal system, different gods, a different cultural identity shaping Europe and North Africa.
Maybe even different patterns of exploration. Given Carthage's maritime heritage, could they have crossed the Atlantic earlier than Columbus?
It's possible to speculate, though their known historical focus was very much on the Mediterranean basin and the Atlantic coasts of Africa and Europe for trade, not necessarily transoceanic voyages. But the bigger point is, the world would undoubtedly look vastly different.
But the sources also offer a strong counterargument to that what if, don't they? About whether Carthage could have sustained an empire even if they'd won militarily.
Yes, that's a crucial point raised in some analyses. Even if Hannibal had won every single battle in Italy, even if he had somehow managed to sack Rome itself, there's a strong argument to be made that Carthage, with its political structure often dominated by merchant oligarchies, perhaps less focused on long-term imperial administration and its heavy reliance on mercenaries, rather than a citizen army deeply invested in the state. Maybe it just didn't have the underlying administrative, political, and social capacity to build and sustain a vast, integrated, long-lasting empire in the way Rome did.
Rome's genius wasn't just military then.
Rome's long-term success, their staying power, wasn't just about winning battles, although they became incredibly good at that, especially after learning painful lessons from Hannibal. It was also about their unique ability to incorporate allies, to grant citizenship, to build infrastructure, to govern conquered territories effectively most of the time, to create a system that inspired loyalty, or at least compliance, across vast areas. That deep-seated resilience, that underlying structure, that might have been Rome's true superpower, something Carthage perhaps lacked to the same degree.
And in a final, almost ironic twist, you could argue that the devastating defeats Hannibal inflicted on Rome, Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae, actually ended up making Rome stronger in the long run.
It's a powerful argument. Those defeats forced Rome to confront its weaknesses, to innovate, to adapt. They had to develop better strategies, like the Fabian approach and Scipio's combined arms tactics. They learned how to mobilize manpower on an unprecedented scale, how to maintain political unity even in the face of disaster. They developed that incredible psychological resilience, that refusal to quit. Rome learned how to absorb crushing blows, lose terrible battles, but ultimately win the war. Hannibal was, in a strange way, Rome's toughest teacher.
It's an amazing lesson, really, echoing through history.
Absolutely.
So there you have it. The epic saga of Hannibal Barca, the tactical marvel of Cannae, the strategic adaptation and resilience of Rome leading to the final showdown at Zama. It's just an incredible story of unparalleled military genius facing off against relentless determination. A critical hinge point in history that truly shaped the world we live in today.
Yeah, understanding this ancient struggle, you really get an appreciation for how strategy, leadership, resources, and maybe even the fundamental character of a state can determine its destiny and lay the groundwork for everything that comes after.
And that leaves us, maybe you, with something to ponder. Considering how Rome ultimately triumphed despite suffering such catastrophic losses early on, does that capacity for adaptation, for learning from failure, for sheer resilience, ultimately prove more decisive in the long sweep of history than even the most brilliant individual military genius?
Or maybe, put another way, just how much of the cultural, legal, and linguistic foundations of our modern world can be traced right back to the very specific outcome of that dusty, bloody battle fought near Zama over 2,000 years ago.
Something worth thinking about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.